Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of 1 Timothy. Today we're looking at 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. Now we've been the last couple of days looking at this final paragraph of chapter 2 of 1 Timothy. Very difficult passage, for Paul talks about the place of women in the church. And what we've seen already is that he says, when we come to worship, we must come in meekness and humility, all of us, and humble ourselves before the Lord. But then he also said women should learn in quietness and in full submission. But we saw yesterday that is simply saying that women are included as well as men. For all disciples of Christ, all disciples, whether men or women, must in humility submit to the teaching of Christ and let it rule over us, the teaching of the Lord. So all must learn in quietness and in submission. So really this passage meant that women have the same place as men in the church. They all have equal rights to discipleship and to bow before the Lord and learn His word. But now verses 12 and 13 are also difficult. Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, and then Eve. Now this is very difficult, obviously, and there are many who have assumed that Paul was saying quite clearly that women cannot have places of authority or leadership or teaching positions in the church. I know many say that. However, I don't think it's quite that simple. There is some ambiguity involved because in other letters of Paul, he assumes that women have places of leadership and teaching authority. For example, let's look at the book of Romans chapter 16. This is the final chapter of Paul's great letter to the church in Rome. In chapter 16, Paul gives a series of greetings to individuals and leaders in the church in Rome. Matter of fact, there are 24 particular names he mentions. All of these seem to be people of influence in the church, of leadership, and of authority. Now, what's interesting is of the 24 names Paul mentions in chapter 16, to whom he sends personal greetings to the church in Rome, of those 24, 6 are women. Now, all of these people seem to be in leadership in the church, and yet 6 of them are women, meaning that Paul seemed to approve, at least in the church in Rome, of women having leadership and positions of authority. Let me bring out just a couple of the things he mentions. Chapter 16 of Romans, verse 1, Paul says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church. Now, obviously, he identifies one of his sisters in Rome, Phoebe, and he identifies her as a deacon, one of the established ministry orders of the early church. Obviously, she had authority and leadership in the church. And then in verse 3, he says, Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ Jesus. They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them. Now, we met Priscilla and Aquila, two companions of Paul, their husband and wife. But isn't it interesting that he mentions Priscilla first? Normally in ancient times, you would talk about a man and a wife, you'd mention the man first. He mentions Priscilla first. That's interesting. But also, all the times we see Priscilla and Aquila, they have roles of leadership in the church. There's even an instance in the book of Acts where they have been left in the city of Ephesus, and a preacher has come through by the name of Apollos. Paul is not with him at the time. Apollos is preaching about Jesus, but his knowledge is incomplete. And so it says, Priscilla and Aquila take him to their home and instruct him in further knowledge of the Lord. Priscilla is involved in that teaching as well as Aquila. But Priscilla is involved in teaching Apollos about further knowledge of the way of the Lord. She has a teaching ministry, in other words. And then in verse 7 of chapter 16 in Romans, Paul says, Greet Andronicus and Junia. Now, Junia is obviously a woman. This is a man and a woman, maybe a husband and wife, we don't know. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews who have been in prison with me. They are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. So Junia is listed as an apostle. She said she was an apostle before I was. Again, a position of leadership in the church. So obviously in Paul's other letters, he does not seem to have a problem with women exercising leadership and authority in the church. But he says to Timothy, I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. So there is some ambiguity in how we should understand this, because in some of his letters, Paul seems to have no trouble with women exercising authority in the church. So what is different about Timothy, the letter to Timothy, from the letter to Rome, that he has this instruction? I think there's a distinction to be made because of where Timothy was. Now, we know from the early part of the letter, chapter 1, Paul had said to Timothy, I left you in Ephesus. So Timothy is carrying on a ministry in Ephesus. So this instruction has to do with a particular need in the church in Ephesus. Now, in tomorrow's session, we're going to look at how the particular culture of Ephesus and how this might have been a particular word that was needed for Ephesus because of their particular context, but a word that was not needed for the church in Rome because their context was different. So join us for tomorrow's session. We'll look at the context in Ephesus and what may have prompted Paul to make this comment about women teaching. So join us next time for our 5-minute Bible study in the book of 1 Timothy.